Yes, absence management. That's ostensibly mainly relating to sickness absence, not necessarily all, but sickness absence is the main thing. I mean, in terms of approach, you've got short-term intermittent absence, and you've got long-term absence, and the different approach quite clear with both. Approach them very different. Short-term intermittent absence is much more likely to be something akin to your own disciplinary procedures. But as an employer, it's reasonable for you to expect a reasonable amount of attendance. It is key to operational success of the business. It's therefore a proportionate and legitimate aim for the company to improve people's attendance. There are various tools that people use. I'll touch on the Bradford Factor in a minute as a management tool and some of the pitfalls. I don't know anybody in the room who uses it as an employer. Quite common in, you used to, but not anymore. Yeah, okay, yeah. It's a useful tool, but it's not absolutely the be all and end all. But many years ago, I used to act for Alasdair. They didn't use the Bradford Factor, but they had so many part-time workers on 16 hours a week, almost invariably women typically, that they were very, very strict on absence, and you'd get a written warning if you'd had a second period of absence in any 3-month rolling contract, any 3-month period. It's quite tough, but there was so many instances that discipline was absolutely essential. But you've got to create a culture really where you're not going to punish people for being genuinely ill. If somebody's ill, they're ill. And it's obviously important that people shouldn't be obliged or feel obliged to come to work simply because they're ill, because it creates longer term health issues and of course can spread disease, as we have seen in recent times. But the process with short-term absence is pretty much akin to the use of your own disciplinary procedures. So we touched on it already, what somebody has to do on the first morning that they're ill. I don't like text messages. Unfortunately, that seems to be the way of the world. Some bigger employers, it's less prevalent than it used to be because of the advent of more online tools. But there were companies that would basically take a whole outsourced solution for absence. So an employee, rather than ring their line manager, which, to be honest, they often feel a little bit daunted by doing perhaps, but they would phone a central number, an absence management company, would record the absence, get the details of the illness and things, and notify the employer, and then move things along depending on, what the issue is. But they would provide that. You're not harassing them, not constantly onto them, but letting them know they are still part of the workforce, letting them know what's going on in work, especially in the case of work-related stress. It's a balance between support and unwanted intrusion. If they want you to back off for a bit, well, back off for a bit. But what happens when you get to a point where you think, actually, we've got to make decisions, we've got to consider replacing that role, for example. And that's where, very much with long-term sickness absence, you will get the issues relating to disability as well, and the consideration of reasonable adjustments, for example, and how much an employer can be expected to go through the hoops. To a degree, it might depend on length of service of the employee, it might depend on the size and the resources of the company as to what might constitute a reasonable adjustment, for example. But fundamentally, there is an obligation on the employer to explore that, and the obligation is on the employer more than the employee. So you've got to look at what the employee can do, focusing a little less on what they can't. So in practical terms, you might have it can really work well, but you might have a situation where somebody's had an injury at work, they can't do the job that they have done, but by exploring what that employee can do. It might be that they're a good trainer. It might be that they've got prior experience in another role. It might be that you can create a role. There are circumstances where creating a role has actually been found to be a reasonable adjustment. So don't turn your mind to it, away from it. You have to go through quite a few hoops. If somebody's off sick long term and they've had an accident at work that's the employer's fault, chances are that employer is going to have to go through a fair few more hoops, but also give longer for somebody to recover, make sure they've got the medical evidence, make sure an employee is fully aware of what the consequences might be if they can't come back. And obviously look at, when you're exploring what adjustments you can make, phased returns to work, for example, less hours, slightly different roles, maybe drop a few of the more onerous tasks off. And it's not just about physical strength, of course. It's about what somebody can cope with and what's reasonable. But again, can the employer make an accommodation for that? There are circumstances where they might not be able to, and that would go beyond what would be reasonable for the employer in those circumstances. So again, medical evidence is key. Workplace assessment might well be also something that you need to consider. But you're going to take a slow, measured approach in many cases.